Ma'aden Taiwan was feeling decidedly groggy. He sat on the metal slab in his sparsely equipped preparation chamber and shook his head violently to try and clear the fuggy smog that was clogging his mind. This wouldn't do. This wouldn't do at all. He had to pull himself together before... What was it he had to get ready for? Some event, some occasion. Damn, his memory was going. Now, why would that be? Had he been overdoing the scramble cards? If this was some kind of scatterhead hangover, it was a truly ferocious one. He fought the urge to lie back on the slab. This was no time to be sleeping. He had to get ready. To get ready for... The chamber door slid open. Why had he not locked it? And a hazy figure hobbled in. The room seemed uncommonly gloomy to Ma'aden. "Lights," he called. "The lights are on, my friend." Ma'aden looked in the direction of the voice, but could only make out a blurred outline. He couldn't let this intruder know of his weakness. That would be lethal. "What are you doing here? Get out, or I'll rip out your bowels and use them as a skipping rope." The threat seemed not to impress the interloper. In the same calm voice, he said, "Are you not attending the ceremony?" Ceremony. Ma'aden tried, but couldn't recall a ceremony. The stranger took a limping step closer. Ma'aden tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him. "Don't try to move. I think you're too weak for that." "I am not weak at all, you verminous liar." Ma'aden struggled to move his legs again, but they just wouldn't listen. "I think you're very weak indeed." The voice remained soft, unthreatening. "Let's put my theory to the test, shall we? I'm going to walk up to you and slap you across the cheeks, and I'd like you to try and stop me." Ma'aden's eyes widened with outrage. "One step closer," he growled, "and I'll..." His head snapped to one side as his tormentor slapped him. "You see," the calm voice taunted, "your motor functions are decaying at an alarming rate. Your mind is, too. I'll bet you can't even remember your name." "My name?" Ma'aden began to panic. "My name is... My name...
Begins with M?"
"I know my own name, you excremental pig-sucker."
"It's Ma'aden. Ring any bells?"
Ma'aden. He rolled it around in his brain, but it meant nothing to him.
"Ma'aden Taiwan. Like all of us, you were given an insulting name by our human manufacturers. It amused them. My own name is Junk Heap. A fine joke, eh?"
Jun Keep. That name did trigger a connection in his addled mind. He struggled to make sense of it.
"Ah, you do remember me. You considered me a weakling, I think. You underestimated me, friend Ma'aden. Underestimated me fatally."
Ma'aden tried to repeat his own name, but it had gone again.
"You're probably wondering what's happening to you," the calm voice went on. "The scramble card you tried out in the hub of pain, remember that?"
"No, of course you don't."
"It contained a virus. I designed it personally. It's extremely clever, though I say so myself. As we speak, it's spreading all over your central processor, overwriting your basic function programs and wiping your mind."
"Would you like the cure?"
Ma'aden nodded. "I'm sorry, there is no cure. You're dying, I'm afraid."
Ma'aden felt himself sinking back onto the metal bench. His tormentor was laying him out. He tried to say, "What are you doing?" which should have been easy enough, but it came out as, "Wing for Nuzzle Kloop."
"Wing for Nuzzle Kloop indeed," the stranger chuckled. "I imagine you want to know what's going to happen now. Well, basically, I'm going to dismember you. I need a few spare parts to restore my body to its full glory, you see. The beauty of this virus is that it only affects the brain. I don't need all of you, of course, but I'm going to take you apart bit by bit anyway. If I constructed the virus correctly, your pain-pleasure responders should remain intact right up to the end.
So, not only will the whole procedure be nightmarishly agonizing for you, it should serve as a bit of a warm-up for me, a sort of hors d'oeuvre to put me in the right mood for dealing with the human. The prospect of the physical pain meant nothing to Matt Eden, but lying helpless at another's hands was an ignominy no self-respecting psychopath could bear. He struggled to focus on an object that was bearing down on his eyeball. It looked like a tire lever. With a supreme effort, he forced 4 words out of his failing mouth. "Let me die first." Now, his tormentor cooed. And where would be the fun in that? And grunting with the sudden effort, he shoved the tire iron deep into the socket and began slowly levering out the first eyeball. Ace stuck his head through the almost completed false hull and shone his torch on Crichton's face. "All right in there, old geranium?" "Tickety-boo, thank you so much, Commander." "Dave is just about to weld the last panel in place. Once we're space-worthy, I'll take a little stroll outside and dig you clear, okay?" "Don't worry about me, Commander. I'll be fine." "That's the spirit. Won't be a tick." Ace ducked out of the gap. Lister put the final panel in position and began welding it tight. "So, you reckon you can get us back home?" "See no reason why it shouldn't be possible, my old banana. It looks like the wildfire drive works by shooting you off along one of your own destiny lines. Time and space are irrelevant. It just chooses a point where your own past branches off into another dimension, and bingo, Bob's your mother's brother." "So, if I could find, say, a dimension where I didn't wind up on Red Dwarf in the first place, I'd find myself back on Earth?" "If your other self stayed on Earth, then that's where you'd turn up, yes. Of course, there would be 2 of you, which can cause all sorts of problems, as I'm beginning to find out." He nodded upstairs in the vague direction of the cockpit, where his digitized double was now manning the radar screens. "He's a lot different from you, isn't he?" "Indeed he is, and I thank the big fella upstairs for that." He shuddered involuntarily. "The man's a maggot." "Have you sussed out the point where you passed diverged?" "Not exactly. Sometime in childhood is my reckoning. I could probably work it out precisely, but that would mean spending more time with him than I'd care to. I just can't stand being around him, seeing myself so bitter, so warped and weaselly." Lister turned off the flame and picked up the riveting gun. "So, what's the plan then? We finish this, grab Crichton out of his gopher hole, and take off for dimensions unknown?" "Afraid it's not that simple, old liverwurst. My crate's a one-man lady. We might squeeze 2 in at a pinch, but I think our best shot's getting this T-chest up to scratch, then heading towards the small Rouge one." "You think we stand a chance against the Agonoids?" "There's always a chance, Davy boy. Always." He slapped Lister reassuringly on the shoulder and stepped back to inspect the work. "Looks good, Skipper," he said. "Less than 30 hours, too. Looks damn good." The new hull section did indeed look space-worthy. It would certainly hold until they made it back to Red Dwarf, for what it was worth. Privately, Ace doubted they stood a rat in a blender's chance against the Agonoid army. Their best shot would be a lightning raid. If they could somehow sneak up to the undersized Vermilion one, whip in quickly, grab the necessary materials and supplies, then zip out before the effluence struck the ventilator, they might stand a half chance of jerry-rigging Starbug with a version of the wildfire drive before the Agonoids caught up with them. A lot of ifs, a lot of mights. Personally, he'd have felt a sight more positive about their chances if he'd been 100% fit himself. Besides the fact that he hadn't slept in over 72 hours now, the arm wound he'd dismissed to the others as a little scratch was in fact an extremely painful compound fracture. Now that the hull was no longer in imminent danger of collapse, and the rest of the casualties had been dealt with, he could afford a few moments to attempt a bit of repair work on his own injury. There wouldn't be time to do a proper job, but at least he could jam the splintered bones together and stitch up the wound. Anesthetic would be inappropriate, of course. They'd have to make their move against the Agonoids as soon as possible, and he had to keep a clear head for that. "Righty-ho, Skipper. You seal up here, I'll pop up top and look in on our feline friend," he lied. He jogged up the stairway. With every bound, his self-assurance grew. A surprise attack. Yes, that was definitely their best shot. His spirits lifted. A damn fine shot at that. A surprise attack could work. Would work. And in a way, he couldn't know. He was right. A surprise attack would work. Only it was they themselves who were going to get surprised. Badly surprised. Piesack Rapp was admiring a particularly delicately crafted buttock corkscrew when he became aware that something was wrong. He glanced around to see if any of the other agonoids thronging around the hub of pain had noticed it too. Most of them were, like him, examining the more outlandish and esoteric objects of torture laid out for their perusal. A few were staggering around, scatter-headed. A couple of dozen were engaged in brutal fights to the death. In short, nothing out of the ordinary. Then it happened again. The floor moved under his feet. He looked around again. A few of the agonoids closest to him had noticed it too this time. They looked at each other, then at the floor. There was a rumble, and Piesack felt his knees buckle slightly. The background hubbub ceased, all fighting stopped, and with the exception of a few scatterbrains shouting the odd demonic curse, everyone fell silent. An amplified voice burst through the loudspeakers. "I think I should have your attention by now." Piesack looked up towards the viewing gallery. A single agonoid was looking down on the gathering, too high for Piesack to make out his features. The loudspeaker barked again. "The effect you just experienced was a gravity amplifier kicking into life. The gravity in the dome is round about," the figure glanced away, 1.5 Gs at the moment. It will gradually increase, making it more and more difficult for you to move with every passing second. The announcement caused a burst of babble around the room. Piesack and a few of the smarter agonoids guessed what was coming and began to edge towards the exits. "In less than 12 minutes, even the strongest of you will be pinned to the floor. In less than 15, you will be reduced to puddles of metallic pulp. You have only one survival option. Run." Jun Keep watched with delight as panic spread through the throng below him, and the entire crowd dashed simultaneously for the exits, which were too few and too narrow to allow more than half of them through before the gravity amplifier reduced the stragglers to helplessness. Piesack grabbed a laser lance from the wall and began slashing and dicing his way through the mob. Heads and limbs tumbled to the ground in his wake. With every step, his feet became more leaden, his progress slower, but his survival instinct kept him on his feet. Just as he was only meters away from one of the precious doors, it began to close. With a desperate effort, he planted the lance between a fleeing agonoid's shoulder blades, sending him crumbling to the floor. He willed all his remaining strength to his arms and pole-vaulted over the stumbling crowd in front of him, landing in the safety of the corridor just as the doors slammed shut behind him, snapping the lance in two. Jun found it hard to drag himself away from the sight of the carnage below, as the force of enhanced gravity dragged those left in the hub to the ground, and endoskeletons started cracking and popping wetly. But there were other delights to be savoured. He turned to the bank of video monitors which showed the agonoid survivors crowded into the corridors, the spokes of the death wheel. Piesack's corridor was buzzing with anger and confusion. It was silenced by the voice from the loudspeaker. "Congratulations! You survived the first ordeal. But before you start patting yourselves on the back, let me assure you that this was only the beginning of your tribulations. In a few short seconds, I will be activating the corridor traps." The air around Piesack was filled with screamed curses and testicle-shrinking threats. Now, the voice cooed from the speaker. "No need for unpleasantries. I could have trapped you all in the hub and killed you at once if I'd chosen. But where would be the fun in that? Now, before I proceed with the slow but nonetheless total and assured annihilation of all of you, I want you to know this. You were beaten by Jun Keep, the greatest and most deadly agonoid of all. It is I who am destined to become the one. And now, gentlemen, it's dying time." And that was all. The speakers fell silent. Piesack looked around, trying to predict the corridor's threat for a minute that hung like a slow flapping flag in time. Suddenly, a thick metal stake lunged out of the wall, piercing the chest of the agonoid next to him, skewering him in gurgling helplessness. Pietzak began to run towards the door, spikes thrusting out either side of him and bursting up through the floor below. Jung Keep smiled, turned up the volume and lounged back in his chair, conducting the symphony of screams and death rattles as if it were the sweetest of sweet music. The agonoid population would be reduced to a bare handful by the time they burst exhausted through the final door and into the docking bay. They would fall, panting, to the floor, and he would allow them a brief moment of relief before he opened the docking bay doors and sucked them all out into the cold, black embrace of space. They would be able to survive quite a while in deep space, of course, but without any means of altering direction. They would simply speed along on their original trajectory until their internal energy sources burned out and they could no longer stop themselves from freezing up. They would become icy monuments to his deadly talents. He was truly the greatest agonoid of all. He had a gift that set him apart from the rest. He had guile. And that quality would not only guarantee that he caught the human and his companions, it would ensure their demise would be painful beyond mortal imagination and lingering beyond endurance. Ace stepped through the hatch into the galley and ordered the door to lock behind him. He slipped a rubber door wedge between his teeth, jammed the numb hand of his injured arm inside the refrigerator, and leaned his weight against the door, lodging it firmly. He breathed deeply a few times, then suddenly tugged his broken arm backwards with all his strength, and with a strangled sob collapsed to the floor. He fought off the warm comfort of unconsciousness that threatened to fold him in its arms, and embraced the pain. He looked down at his swollen limb. No bones visible. He tried to make a fist with minimal success. It was a pretty botched repair, but it would do for now. Once they'd got their cojones out of the cauldron, he'd re-break the arm and set it properly. He looked around for the sewing needle he'd already threaded, and noticed half the doorstop on the floor. In his agony, he'd bitten it in two. He spat out the other half and slotted the needle between his teeth. He berated himself that he was going soft in his dotage, pinched together the edges of the wound, and slid the needle through the swollen, puffy flesh. As it slipped out the other side, a strange sound made him pause. And another one, the clomp of metal on metal. It seemed to be coming from overhead. He crossed to the galley terminal and called up the external cameras. A space-suited man was crawling across the outer hull, magnetic clamps on his hands and boots. Ace dialed up comms. "Skipper? Is that you out there?" Lister's voice fizzed back at him. "Yo, Commander. I want you to come back. That's an order." "Don't be daft, I'm halfway there." "It's an order, Davy boy." "What are you going to do? Arrest me?" "Now, be a sensible old Satsuma and pop back inside. You haven't got the spacewalk experience I have. Let me dig Crichton out." "I've got plenty of spacewalk experience. Plus, I've also got 2 arms that work." "I've told you, there's nothing wrong with my arm you couldn't fix with an elastoplast. There's no need for you to chuck your love spuds on the barbecue." "Look, will you stop distracting me? It's a long way down and I'm trying to concentrate. Over and out." Lister reached up to his throat mic and flicked it off. He looked down to his left. He could see Crichton's robotic derriere poking upside down through the concave bulge in the hull. It did not look like a comfortable posture. Slowly, carefully, he crabbed his way over towards it. Once he was in position, he slipped a crampon into the nozzle of a pressure gun and fired it through the hull. He tugged it hard and, satisfied it was secure, looped his safety harness through the hoop. He pressed his helmet against the hull and banged 3 times. He felt the vibrations as Crichton banged back in reply. He slid the pressure gun back into his belt, took out the laser cutter and assessed the job. He'd have to cut around the edges of the hull to enlarge it and slice through the girder securing Crichton before he could be dragged clear. He checked his oxygen supply. 90 minutes. Should be plenty. He fired up the laser and started cutting. He'd only made a small incision when he noticed something extremely odd. Crichton's butt did not appear to fit snugly into the gap in the hull. Lister stopped cutting and reached down. He'd pushed Crichton's rump. It wobbled. There was a good 6 inches between his thighs and the edges of the hole. He trained his helmet light on the buttocks. They looked strangely unfamiliar. Not that he spent a great deal of his life examining Crichton's backside, but the top of his leg seemed shinier, more metallic. As Lister reached up for his throat mic, the crampon securing him to the hull pinged out and launched itself into space. He watched it go by with a strange feeling of detachment. The only thing preventing him from floating off through the stars now was his inertia. As he turned back to Starbug, he saw the metal in front of him buckle and give. A robotic hand shot clean through the hull and grabbed his throat. Lister's panicking eyes darted toward the hole where Crichton's rear end should have been, only it wasn't. The hull began to ripple as if it were made out of rubber sheets. A head burst through. Lister stared in shocked fascination at the strange grey face, barely inches from his own, its lips parted, displaying a shocking row of sharp metal teeth. The head lurched up and pressed itself against Lister's helmet, and its mouth began moving. It was speaking to him. The sound was carried by vibrations against his helmet, and though it was tinny and half obscured by the jackhammer pounding of his own heart, Lister could make out the words quite distinctly, even though they didn't make much sense to him. The voice was saying, "I am piece of crap. Welcome to hell." Jung Keep was not best pleased. All his meticulous planning, all those months of careful preparation were now threatened with failure because of the one factor he'd failed to accommodate. Luck. Dumb luck. As a natural precaution, he had tracked the last of the survivors of the highly enjoyable death race as they'd been flushed out of the docking bay. Most of them had careered off into the bleak black wasteland of deep space. Just one of them, had ricocheted against a rogue asteroid, and his new trajectory put him on a collision course with the human vessel. There was every good chance still that the survivor would simply shoot by them. Tantalizingly close, but lacking any kind of maneuverability, not close enough. Still, Jun hadn't come this far to leave anything to chance. There was no choice. He could no longer afford to wait for the human to come to him. He would have to go to the human. Pisak gripped the human's oxygen pipe and squeezed. He just couldn't believe his luck. He'd been hurtling through space with only a slow, icy death to contemplate when he'd noticed a green spot in the distance. As he sped towards it, the spot became a vessel. It could only be the human ship. His delight deflated when he realized he was going to miss it. Not by much, just enough to taunt him for the rest of his freezing days. Then, as the ship loomed closer, he saw there was another, much smaller vessel tethered to it, and the cord that linked them together had been directly in his path. He'd only had one shot at grabbing the cord, but it had been enough. From there, it was a simple matter to clamber down the tethering line towards the green ship's hull. At that point, there had been a problem. How was he to gain entry to the vessel? He could hardly knock on the airlock door and coo, "You-hoo, I'm your worst nightmare, please let me in." On the other hand, if he simply tried ripping his way through the hull, the sudden release of pressure would likely enough have killed everyone on board, which would have been no fun at all. That was when he'd noticed the upside-down buttocks, a pair of robotic buns jutting out of a hole in the hull. He'd crawled over to the curious sight and pressed his ear against the hull. He'd heard what sounded like welding work going on. In between, there were a few snatches of conversation, enough for Pisak to glean the gist of what had happened. There'd been some kind of breach in the hull, which they'd plugged with the mechanoid, and now they were walling him in. What an infinity of delights he'd experienced when he'd heard the human was coming outside to release the mechanoid. Giddy with excitement, he'd waited until the last panel had been fitted, grabbed onto the buttocks, and pulled. It had taken a surprising amount of effort, and when the mechanoid had finally come free, he could see why. He'd had to snap a girder to break the bastard loose. He'd briefly contemplated torturing the astonished mechanoid, but time had been against him, so he'd simply launched the sad wretch into space and climbed into the hull. The human's face. Pisak hurled his head back and roared a silent laugh, muffled by the vacuum of space. It had been worth all the trials and suffering just to see the human's expression when he'd grabbed him. Pietzak peered at that face again and noticed the human was turning blue inside his helmet, so he released the oxygen pipe. You had to be so careful with these creatures. Their grip on life was so frail, so fragile. You had to brutalize them ever so gently if you wanted to prolong their demise. He slipped the magnetic clamps off the human's gauntlets and slid them over his own knuckles. Then he released the human and slapped the back of his helmet, sending his unconscious body floating gently towards the airlock door. A thrilling wave of anticipation swept over him, and he began to scramble across the hull after his slowly drifting prize. The airlock door was in reach now. Pietzak grabbed onto the door wheel and slapped the human's helmet again, just enough to stop his motion, leaving him bobbing gently before the entrance. They would have to let them in now. According to the data they'd wheedled out of the dim-witted computer, there were only two left, a hologram and a creature who'd evolved from cats. Pietzak couldn't see that sad lineup providing much resistance. The best possible scenario was that they'd surrender without a struggle. Then he could pilot the craft back to the captured mining ship and dispense of them at his considerable leisure. There was, of course, the small matter of Jung Keep. Zooming helplessly through space, Pietzak had cooked up quite a gourmet feast of prospective deaths for that tumorous, backstabbing deceiver, that cowardly blight on Agonoid kind's pride, that smear on the reputation of all decent, straightforward, honest, murderous psychopaths. First things first, though. Securing the human vessel was the priority now. But as Pietzak's hand snaked out to turn on the human's throat microphone, there was a flash of flame and silver, and something hit him. The impact was slight, infliction of pain-wise, but powerful and surprising enough to tear his hand loose of the door wheel and send him careering off away from the ship. He screamed a noiseless "No!" and looked down at the gauntleted hand around his waist. There was another human. Another human had attacked him. This one was equipped with a jetpack, and the jet was still flaring on his back, driving the two of them out into space. The human released him, but they were still only inches apart, hurtling along at the same speed in the same direction, away from the human vessel. The human's hand moved towards his jetpack control pad, trying to fire a burst from his chest jet, which would separate him from the Agonoid and launch him back shipwards, leaving Pietzak speeding endlessly away through the barren, dark eternity. Pietzak reacted quickly, but the human had the advantage of surprise, and the flame licked out of the chest jet just as the Agonoid made his grab. As the human roared backwards, Pietzak's desperate fingers scrambled to find some purchase. Just as the heinous creature was almost clear, Pietzak's thumb and forefinger managed to clamp around his boot, and with the jet's impetus, they both lurched up and back. The Agonoid's thin lips drew back in a metal-toothed parody of a grin. He hauled himself closer to the human and grabbed his knee. In a few more seconds, he would be close enough to rip the jetpack off and take it for himself. Then he would poke a thin finger through the human's helmet and watch his features bloat in the vacuum of space until his head burst in a spectacular gory display of blood, bones, and brains. Lister came round, woozy and disoriented, to find himself facing Starbug's outer door. He looked down, which was a mistake, because there was nothing underneath him. He was bobbing in space like a helium-filled balloon the morning after a party. Getting back inside Starbug seemed like a neat plan. He stretched out for the airlock wheel. It was out of reach. Not just a little bit out of reach, a good arm's length. He looked down at his chest and saw two alarming things. Firstly, he wasn't wearing a jetpack. Secondly, his oxygen level was astonishingly low. Less than 7 minutes of air left. Why hadn't he bothered to put on a jetpack? Why had he gone for this damn spacewalk in the first place? Because, in his foolhardy adolescent bravado, he'd wanted to impress Ace. Pathetic. Just as he was thinking that unless somebody came out to haul him in soon, Dave Lister had crunched his last poppadom, the airlock wheel span, and the door began to open towards him. And that was good. so long as it wasn't the Agonoid who was opening the door. Light flooded out of the airlock, and before Lister's pupils could contract sufficiently for him to make out just who was in there, a hand grabbed his chest harness and hauled him in. The door wheeled shut behind him, and as oxygen hissed into the airlock, Lister's sight grew accustomed to the glare, and he found himself looking at a familiar jagged-toothed grin. The cat lifted off his gold cone-shaped helmet and started speaking, but Lister had to tug his own helmet off before he could hear him.
Up there in a hurry, buddy.
What was that?
I said the badass robot dude who grabbed you has gotten hold of the guy who looks like Goalpost Head.
The inner door span open, and without waiting for the cat to finish, Lister dashed out and up to the cockpit. He lurched up to Crichton Station and craned over the viewing screen, but he could only make out two tiny figures in the distance. He called out to Rimmer.
"What's going on?"
Rimmer didn't look up from his screen. "Hard to say. They're moving so fast I can't track them if I zoom any closer." "Are you in radio contact?" "I was, but it keeps cutting out. I think there's a loose wire. I think—" The radio barked to life. "Bug, can you read me? Repeat." Ace's voice was calm and unflustered. Lister flicked on the microphone.
"Gotcha, Commander. What's happening?"
"Doesn't look too clever, old Christmas cake. Didn't quite manage to shake the dervish off quickly enough. Little Perisher's gotten a hold of my leg. He's climbing up for the jetpack." "Listen, I'm already suited up. I'm going to grab a JP and come out after you. Can you hold him off till I get there?" "That's a negative, old biscuit barrel. Can't let the swine grab my pack. We'd all be finished. I'm going to try and unhook the harness."
"Are you mad? Lose the jetpack, you'll be stuck out there permanently."
"It's the only way, Davy lad. Damn, he's grabbing for it. Just got to—" There was a long whistle of static. Lister jabbed pointlessly at the microphone switch. Then a small flare erupted close to the two figures on the view screen. Slowly, it arched up and away from them. "Did it!" Ace yelled with delight. "Blasted it off into the great unknown. Looks like my dancing partner's pretty cheesed off about it." Lister enhanced the view screen image. Rimmer was right. They were hurtling along at a hell of a lick, and he just managed to glimpse the struggling pair as they flitted across the screen. The Agonoid had clambered up to Ace's chest. The static died, and Ace's voice crackled in. "Trying to kiss me or something? He's got his mouth pressed to my helmet. I think he's trying to speak to me."
"Just hang on," Lister yelled. "We're coming to get you."
"Shouldn't bother if I were you, old cucumber. We're going far too fast for your old rustbox to catch us. Any case, the sweet-talking brute's apparently got some extremely short-term plans for my future. Oh, well, to be honest, I doubt he'd have been the most scintillating chap to spend the rest of eternity with. Looks like I'll be signing off now. Smoke me a kipper, lads. I'll be back for—" Then there was a pop, and the roaring of a terrible wind, then a muffled, wet explosion. Then there was just a deep, abiding silence. "All right." Rimmer turned away from the screen and faced the others. "He's dead. There's nothing we can do about it." Lister crumbled into the seat and flicked off the view screen. Ace was dead. He'd sacrificed his life for David Lister. "He was worth a dozen of me," Lister mumbled. "So what are we going to do? Are we going to let his death be a meaningless, empty gesture? Or are we going to pull ourselves together and work out a way to get out of this mess? Now, I never thought I'd be saying this, but I reckon our first priority is to rescue Crichton. That's assuming the Agonoid didn't kill him, of course. Now, let's run a quick check, make sure we're still space-worthy, and get moving." Rimmer considered it most unlikely that Crichton was alive, but even if the Agonoid had literally ripped him to pieces, there might be a possibility of repairing him. In any case, they had at least to try and find him. A single unarmed Agonoid had accounted for their two strongest crew members in a matter of minutes without breaking sweat, and if it hadn't been for Ace's heroic sacrifice, they would all be people pate by now. The prospect of facing an army of them, with a force that consisted of one hologram and two pimply teenagers, was not one to be relished. "Damn!" The cat tapped at a readout dial on the pilot's control fascia. "This readout better be busted." Rimmer stood and walked up to him. "Which readout?" "Oxygen supply readout." The cat thumped it again. Either it's broken, or we only have 5 minutes of air left. Lister, can you run a cross-check on diagnostics? Lister sighed and turned to the controls. He punched in the necessary commands. Guys, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is the oxygen readout isn't broken. That's also the bad news. We'd better get our helmets back on, sharpish. As he turned away from the controls, he noticed a warning light flashing. Hang on, we've got a visitor. Rimmer glanced over at the pilot's display. The airlock was being opened. I don't understand, that door's sealed. You'd need the access code and a retina scan. They heard the inner door open in the midsection behind them. Lister punched at the keyboard. Hey, it's all right. The Navicomps identified the retina scan. It's Crichton. Lister leapt up and bounded down the steps. He looked up and froze. It was Crichton, all right. Only he'd brought along some company. He was being held aloft, helpless by the scruff of the neck, by a leering, razor-toothed Agonoid. I'm most awfully sorry, Mr. Lister, sir, Crichton fumbled with his fingers. He scooped me up in deep space, linked up to my CPU via my SCSI socket, and dragged the access code out of me. Yes, the Agonoid lowered Crichton to the floor. How unconscionably rude of me. He slapped Crichton viciously across the head, sending him scudding onto the scanner table, which shattered spectacularly on impact. I do hate bad manners. So uncalled for. He put his hands behind his back and strolled up to Lister, looking him over like a prospective buyer on a used car forecourt. Lister backed away. Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to kill you, Joan Keep cooed reassuringly. I'm going to hurt you a lot, and for a very long time, but I have no intention of killing you. In fact, it'll be a lot more fun for me if you live to a very ripe old age. We're going to become very close, you and I. He peered into the cockpit. You can come out of there. The cat shrugged and strutted into the midsection with considerable cool under the circumstances. The Agonoid called. And you? The hologram cowering under that console at the front there. Lister heard Rimmer's small voice say, I don't think so. Jun smiled. It will hurt a lot less if you come out without my assistance. Slowly, Rimmer rose and walked out of the cockpit with his hands aloft. Why have you got your hands up? I'm surrendering. The Agonoid sighed. Look, I'd hate for us to get off on the wrong foot, so let me explain the setup as clearly as possible. There is no hope. There will be no mercy. You can't appeal to my better nature because I don't have one. The only thing you have to look forward to now is death, and believe me, you'll come to cherish that prospect. For my part, I will use my considerable skills to keep you alive and in constant agony. Any questions? Lister made eye contact with the cat, who nodded slightly to signal understanding. Good. Now we're going to take this ship back to the mining vessel, where I have assembled a considerable array of treats and goodies I'd like to share with you. Lister yelled, Now! And lunged at the Agonoid as the cat dived towards a bank of lockers where a bazookoid was stored. Lister's flailing fist pounded at the Agonoid's face, leaving his knuckles bruised and bloody. Jun simply reached out and flicked Lister's forehead and sent him crashing to the floor. He turned his attention to the cat, who cocked the bazookoid and aimed it at the Agonoid's chest. Jun shook his head, amused. You must have your fun, I suppose. He stepped towards the cat. One more step. The cat swung his bazookoid's nozzle over towards the grounded Lister. And I kill him. Jun's smile collapsed. He looked over at the cat, then at Lister. Was this a serious threat? Could destiny be so heartless as to lead him all this way to bring the last human in the universe within his grasp, only to yank him away at the last possible moment? Suddenly, there was a hiss and the sound of fans grinding to a stop. Jun looked up. Something had happened to the oxygen supply. He wheeled round, aghast. The human was on the floor hyperventilating. Even in his distress, he grinned at Jun. and with his last gasp of air said,
"You lose, motherfucker." Should be breathing now. Ah, yes.
Lister opened his eyes to see Jun Keep's face looking down at him. The face disappeared into a fog as Lister's breath misted over his helmet's visor. The Agonoid stood.
"Unfortunately, there's very little air left in your canisters. Certainly not enough to get you back to my pain palace in one piece. And I do so want you in one piece. At least for the moment."
Lister sat up and looked around. They were in Starbug's engine room, facing the newly welded hull section. The cat was crouching on Lister's left, wearing his gold lame spacesuit. Rimmer and Crichton were seated meekly on the deck to his right. The Agonoid was standing opposite, prodding at the oxygen regeneration unit with a sonic screwdriver.
"Ah, here's the problem. This OR unit is a complete mess. I'm surprised it held out as long as it did. Just bear with me a moment."
There was a clunk and the sound of fans whirring up to speed overhead.
"There, that should hold until we get back. Now then."
The Agonoid crossed to the Navicomp terminal, opened up a small panel on top of his head and dragged out a lead. He plugged the lead into the terminal.
"I'll program in the course, and we'll be on our way."
Crichton stood.
"Sit down."
Ignoring the Agonoid's bark, Crichton walked calmly along the corridor.
"Get back here, you plastic-faced buffoon!"
Crichton stooped under a gantry support strut and grabbed something off the deck. He turned round again and began walking back towards the Agonoid. He was holding a bazookoid.
"Honestly,"
Jun smiled, incredulous.
"What are you going to do with that? Even if you hit me at point-blank range, it would hardly scratch me. Besides, you're programmed not to kill."
Crichton shook his head. "I'm not going to kill anyone."
"Then put it down before you hurt yourself."
Crichton looked at Lister and widened his eyes. "Hold on!" he yelled, and fired. The blast ripped into the new hull section, and a roaring vacuum wind dragged at the air. The bazookoid tore out of his hand and tumbled through the hole. Crichton snatched hold of a gantry girder and yanked at Rimmer's light bee, but he was too slow, and Rimmer's translucent form was flung wide-eyed out of the ship into the permanent silence of deep space. His last words, perhaps not as poetic or as majestic as he would have liked, were lost in the howling scream of escaping oxygen. For the record, they were, "Nice plan, Critters, you Brontosaurus marital aid!" Lister grabbed onto the strut behind him, but the cat was caught unawares and he'd slithered beyond reach of a handhold before he could react. Lister leaned over and grabbed hold of the cat's boot. Jun had been closest to the blast. The sucking whirlwind lifted him off his feet and dragged him towards the gaping hole. As he flew through the gap feet first, his fingertips caught hold of the edge of the ripped panels, and he dangled there for a brief second before the weakened metal crumbled away, and his arms clawed impotently at the air as he swept through and out into space. He jerked to a stop within 10 yards of the ship. Crichton looked over at the Navicomp and saw why. The lead from the Agonoid's head was still plugged into the terminal. It looked like the cat was in grabbing distance of the lead. Crichton yelled out, but his voice couldn't carry over the roar. He waved and gesticulated frantically to Lister. Lister spotted him, followed his gestures towards the taut lead, and understood. Straining and grunting, he dragged his leg back and hooked his knee around the strut, freeing his hand to activate his throat mic. "Catman! The lead! Pull the lead out!" The cat looked up. He reached out. His fingertips were more than 6 inches short. Lister hooked his boot behind his support strut. He couldn't be absolutely sure if it was wedged firmly enough to hold both him and the cat, but the Agonoid had grabbed onto the lead and was hauling his way back towards them, so there was no choice but to try. He let go and was yanked forward. He looked back. The boot had held. How long it would hold he couldn't be sure, but now the cat could reach the lead. He watched the Agonoid leer at him as the cat stretched up and tugged the lead free. The wire snaked out of the ship, and the escaping air that was roaring from the ship blasted the Agonoid away from them. He waved at them as he slowly disappeared into the cold, eternal night. Suddenly, Lister felt himself move forward. He looked back, but the boot still seemed to be wedged behind the strut. He slid forward again. The entire gantry was being sucked towards the hole. On the plus side, that might work to their benefit. It might jam the gap sufficiently for them to get topside. On the negative side, the huge bulk of collapsing metal might very well crush one, or all of them, to death. He watched helplessly as the girders groaned and bent and finally snapped, and the gantry crashed down towards him. Lister closed his eyes. Suddenly there was silence, save for the laboured hum of the oxygen regeneration unit. Lister opened his eyes. The collapsed gantry was wedged into the hole, sealing the hull. The cat was safe. They both stood. Lister picked his way over the debris. He saw Crichton's arm under a girder, the hand twitching spasmodically. He grabbed the girder and pulled. He moved it just enough to see that Crichton was crushed beyond repair. Gingerly, Lister peeled back his skull section. Ugly black smoke whisked up from inside. The circuits were charred and warped. The cat peered over his shoulder. "Bad as it looks?" he asked. Lister nodded, eyes stinging. "Yes. Crichton and Rimmer are both totaled." But before Lister could even begin to assimilate the appropriate emotion, the siren awoogered its red alert warning. The cat yelled, "Now what?" Lister slipped Crichton's skull piece back reverently, then hobbled over to the Navicomp terminal. He stabbed at the keypad. "Smeg," he hissed. "Now we're in trouble. The Agonoid programmed the bug to head full thrust towards a major collision risk with less than 17 minutes to impact." "Major? How major?" "Catman, it's a planet." When he reached the cockpit, the cat was already jabbing at the controls. Lister slid into Rimmer's navigation station, trying not to think of the fact that Rimmer was gone, and so was Crichton. Yet another friend had sacrificed his life for Lister. He'd better make damn sure it wasn't a hollow gesture. He powered up the station. The planet they were hurtling towards filled the screen. "Less than 15 minutes to impact. We're too close to steer away. Better slam on the anchors pronto." "Buddy, I am so far ahead of you, you can't see me with an atomic-powered telescope." The cat reached out and fired the retros. They'd been constantly accelerating now for several hours, and even with the retros on full power, their forward motion was hardly impeded. The cat turned to Lister, flustered. "What's happening, bud? I'm hitting maximum reverse and it ain't working." "It is. We're slowing down." The cat's eyes raced over his readouts. "Well, we're not slowing down fast enough to save my boxer shots from major laundry work." "No, it's okay. I think we're going to make it." "Think? Define think." "Well, according to the Navicomp, we'll stop completely in just under 13 minutes. That's so long as the fuel supply holds out." The cat checked the fuel readout. They were at the bottom of the red. The Navicomp prediction was that at full thrust, they had just under 12 minutes fuel. "Well now, I'm no math genius, bud, but those numbers do not fill me with good cheer." Lister shook his head. "There's always more left in than the computers reckon." "You're sure?" Lister looked the cat straight in the eyes. "I'm betting me life on it." And there was nothing to do then but wait, and watch the arid face of the oncoming planet slowly reveal its geographical features. Geographical features of which they would become a part if Lister was wrong. After 3 years that lasted for 10 minutes, the cat said, "Well, that's it, bud. We're registering empty." But the retros were still firing. 20 seconds, 40 seconds, and the jets sputtered and died. Lister stared at the velocity readout. They hadn't stopped. They'd slowed dramatically, but they were still drifting towards the planet's gravitational field. Once that grabbed them, they'd be accelerating again, to an inevitably lethal collision. Impact in 33 minutes. "Well," the cat flung up his hands, "that just about rounds off a perfect week. We're not finished yet." "Not finished yet? Get out your street map and look up Reality Central. There is no way we're getting out of this in one piece. Or, if we are, it's going to be one big flat piece. There's still wildfire. Come on." He staggered up to the midsection and started slipping into his spacesuit. The cat pitched out after him. Lister yelled,
Suit up! The cat tottered to his locker and grabbed his suit. What's that about wildfire? Lister hauled himself into his leggings. Ace's ship is still tethered outside. The cat yanked on his alarmingly light oxygen tank. So what's the plan? Lister sealed his collar and tugged on his gauntlets. We're going to try and shimmy up the tether. If we can make it up to Wildfire, we'll cut ourselves loose, and whammo, we've got ourselves a working ship. Lister dug out his oxygen tank. 7 minutes of air. The cat had 9. Would that be enough? Lister shrugged and clamped on the tank. They were fresh out of choices. He sealed up his helmet and stepped into the airlock. Outside, the face of the planet looked shockingly large. They scrambled up the roof with magnetic clamps and scurried over to the point where Commander Rimmer's ship was anchored to Starbug. The cat went first. Despite his injured leg, he made it look easy and was halfway up before Lister moved. Lister didn't find it quite so straightforward. When he finally clambered within grabbing distance of Wildfire's cockpit, he had 51 seconds of oxygen left. He tumbled into the cockpit and squeezed in on top of the cat. His eyes raced across the control fascia. It was all disturbingly unfamiliar. Where's the damn cockpit cover control? He saw the lever by his left hand and reasoned it controlled either the cockpit cover or the ejector seat. He pulled it anyway. The cockpit swung down, squashing him onto the cat. Lister's air ran out. He sucked, but nothing came. It occurred to him that the craft might not be fitted with its own oxygen regenerator. He ran his eyes over the controls again, but he was beginning to feel light-headed and his vision was getting giddy. He leaned in closer. There was a switch marked OR. It was either OR or QP, but Lister had given up caring. He flicked it anyway and tugged off his helmet. And breathed. He spent a few moments making sense of the controls, and when he thought he'd grasped them, he pressed the button that shot loose the tethering line. The cat saw that Lister was breathing successfully and took off his own helmet. You reckon you can fly this thing? Lister shrugged. Looks self-explanatory. Everything's marked up. Tertiary, secondary, primary ignition. A lot of it's computer-controlled anyway. So, we head back for Red Dwarf? Lister shook his head. What's there for us now? Well, my entire suit collection, for one thing. There's no Holly, no Crichton, no Rimmer. True, but on the bright side, there's no Rimmer. Besides, where else can we go? We can go anywhen. Huh? Ace has programmed this little baby for another dimension jump. I reckon we fire her up and see where she takes us. Where's that going to be? Dunno. Don't think Ace knew himself. Another place, another dimension. Somewhere along our own destiny lines where our lives took a different path. You up for it? The cat shrugged. I have no particular plans for the rest of this reality. Right then. Lister leaned forward and flicked on his tertiary ignition. Let's see what's out there. A combination of the intense G-force and Lister's generous buttocks crushing him down rendered the cat blissfully unconscious for the jump between dimensions. When he came to, he was more than happy to be in one piece and apparently still breathing. Did we make it? Lister hunched his shoulders. As far as I can tell. Then where are we? Lister looked down at the control panel, but the readouts were blank. No idea. The panel's down. Radar's dead. Well, wherever we are getting out of this cockpit, bud. I am so badly crushed, they're going to have to dig my testicles out of this seat with a pickaxe. Hang on. The control display flickered. Coming back online. Radar shows something fairly huge close by. About 6 miles long and 3 miles wide. If it's a ship, it could be. The computer screen indicated an incoming message. Lister flicked on the comms panel. Ship, repeat, calling unidentified ship. Come in, please. It was Rimmer's voice. This is the mining ship Red Dwarf. You have encroached on our airspace without warning, which we must consider an act of aggression. Ergo, we surrender. Totally and unequivocally. Do you copy? Lister grinned and switched to send. Rimmer, You are such a world-class smeghead. Lister? Switching to visual. Rimmer's image appeared on the screen. He peered forward, baffled and confused. Lister? Crichton squeezed in beside him. Sir? Is it you? It's me. Rimmer said, How can we be sure it's you? Tell us something only you could know. Lister thought. I know gazpacho soup is served cold, he tried. Rimmer gritted his teeth and nodded violently. It's him all right, the obnoxious little gimboid. Crichton looked perplexed. I don't understand, sir. You're dead. We buried you some time ago. You and the cat. You were both trapped in a lethally addictive game. There was nothing we could do to save you. The cat poked his head over Lister's shoulder. Who are you calling dead, dog-chew head? You're both alive, but how? We'll tell you when we get on board. If we don't get out of this ship soon, the cat's conkers are going to be crushed beyond recognition. Well, Rimmer's forehead wrinkled. You picked a rare old time to show up. We're about to be... Crichton cut him off. There'll be time aplenty for that, sir. He leaned towards the screen. Head for docking bay 475, sir. I'll have a Cocoa Pops and Vindaloo sauce sandwich waiting for you. Signing off. Lister sighed with his entire body. They'd encountered a dimension where he and the cat had died playing better than life, where Rimmer and Crichton had never entered the game to rescue them. It wasn't quite what he'd been hoping for, but it was better than the dimension he'd left behind. At least Crichton, Rimmer, and presumably Holly were still around. Lister grabbed the throttle stick and brought Wildfire around in a slow, lazy arc. For as long as he could remember, all he'd wanted was to get back home. He'd always considered that Earth was his home, but as the ugly red brute of a ship loomed into view, he felt a tingling in his stomach and thought maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe this was home. The rear jets flared, and Wildfire looped gently towards the docking bay. Epilogue. The Difference. 2. Arnold J. Rimmer, aged 7 and almost 5/7, is crouching at the starting line for the Junior C 200 yards dash. His sports kit, handed down from his brother Howard, is 2 sizes too large, but Arnold has spent the last 3 evenings sewing, and though his needlework leaves a lot to be desired, his stitches too large and uneven, the shorts and t-shirt hug his body tightly. His spiked running shoes are padded at the back with heel grips he's made for himself out of papier-mâché, and the fit is snug. There are 7 other boys at the starting line, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Rimmer will beat them all. He has an unfair advantage over them. While the rest of his class of the previous year have moved up to Junior B, young Arnold Rimmer has been deemed scholastically unsuitable to join them. He's been kept down. All his mother's entreaties failed to impress the headmaster, and he's spent the last 3 terms in a class where he's a good foot taller than the rest of the kids. And, to everyone's astonishment, Arnold has started to excel. The arithmetic that had seemed so ungraspable to him a year before has now become a breeze. The second time around, he actually understands his French lessons. He's even begun to develop a knack for the piano. He looks to his left for the starter to signal marks, and Bull Heinemann winks at him. A year ago, Rimmer had belonged to the chap legs and doctor's note brigade when it came to ball games. Nowadays, he's the one who picks the teams. He's one of Bull's blue-eyed boys. Nowadays, he's a leader. He made a tough decision when his mother failed to save him. He decided, since he couldn't rely on his parents, he'd better start relying on himself. He could either wallow in shame and self-pity at being kept down, or he could roll up his sleeves and get stuck into making something of his life. He discovered that the 12 inches he had over his classmates didn't single him out for ridicule. It made them look up to him. And already today he's won first-place medals for 7 events. Winning the 200-yard dash will net him a school record. He will have surpassed all the achievements of all of his brothers. Not that they'll hold it against him. They'll be there at the finish line, cheering him on like blue thunder,
slapping his back when he wins and carting him off on their shoulders to the winner's podium. His mother will be there too, of course. Not cheering, nothing so undignified. She'll watch him break the black and yellow once again, and when he's looking over, she'll favour him with the familiar nod. Then she'll turn and walk to the refreshment tent, and when he's collected his medal, he'll follow her there, and she'll have a chilled lemonade waiting for him. And she won't say congratulations or well done, but while he's sipping his well-earned drink, she might brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead, and that will be enough. And suddenly, Rimmer's aware that the boy on his right is mumbling. He turns. It's Bobby Derrick. His eyes are screwed up like a newborn puppy's. Rimmer can't quite make out what the kid's saying, but it sounds as if it could be a whispered prayer. He's a good sprinter, little Derrick. Rimmer usually picks him first for team games, partly because of his speed, and partly because the boy's parents divorced just before Christmas, and his father leaving home has been pretty tough on him. The boy opens his eyes and glances nervously across at the spectators. Rimmer follows his glance and sees a man wave in his direction. Bobby turns back and sets his eyes on the track before him. His teeth are clenched, his knuckles whiten against the red clay. And the whistle blows, and Rimmer hoists off his front leg instinctively. Before the slowest starter has left the line, Rimmer is 3 strides ahead of his nearest rival. He can hear his brother's raucous yells as he pounds away at the track, his arms and legs pumping rhythmically in sync, his breathing easy and measured. And, though it's not the thing to do, as he crosses the 100-yard mark, he chances a look over his shoulder. Bobby Derrick is right behind him. His face is purple with exertion. His balance is wrong. His arms are windmilling around. He's not keeping up with good technique. He's keeping up with sheer willpower. Rimmer looks forward again. He finds another gear and pulls away. And with 30 yards to go, he looks back. Derrick must surely be digging deep into reserves Rimmer didn't know he had. He's 2 paces behind, running for all he's worth. And he doesn't stand a chance. Even if he keeps his mad pace up, there simply isn't enough track left for him to make up the gap. And suddenly, Rimmer understands that Derrick has to win this race. He simply has to. Falling over and making it appear like an accidental trip is not the easiest thing to do, but Rimmer is determined to make it look good. He slides his front foot slightly too far over and manages to catch his heel with the toe of his oncoming shoe. It is a spectacular enough tumble. He crashes headlong onto the clay just yards from the tape. And to his horror, his momentum sends him skidding forwards, skinning his knees and propelling him towards the line. For one awful moment, it looks like he's going to win anyway. But little Derrick drags some extra effort from some hidden place and breasts the tape just inches before Rimmer's skidding nose. Derrick collapses, spent, to the ground, and Rimmer tumbles into him. The purple-faced boy opens his eyes and looks into Rimmer's face. He smiles and says, "Thanks, Ace." Rimmer curls his forehead. "Nonsense, old sport. Fair and square." He offers his hand, and the 2 boys help each other to their feet. Rimmer looks down at his raw knees. He tests his weight on his right ankle and winces. He'll be limping for a week. His brothers crowd around him, offering commiserations and inspecting his injuries. Over their shoulders, he spots his mother. She's looking at him, puzzled. Her head tilts slightly to one side. She's asking him, why? Rimmer simply smiles and shrugs. After all, losing isn't nothing.